In 2020, Democrats took full control of Washington.
And it will give Democrats control of the Senate.
Joe Biden has been elected.
But Republicans stood up in the states.
There was no blue wave. Democratic down-ballot disasters carried all the way to the state legislatures.
Now, we're the last line of defense against the Democrats' socialist agenda. The ways we're fighting back are bigger than you think. Welcome back, and thank you for joining episode 11 of It's Bigger Than You Think, a conversation about the politics that most impact our daily lives. I'm your host, Annie Moore, and joining me today is Will Douglas. He's a small business owner and a pharmacist, and he's also recently announced his candidacy for a Texas House district. So, Will, thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely, Annie. I appreciate you for having me on today.
We're going to just dive right in, and we're going to talk about your story. What brought you to Texas? Why pharmacy school? The whole shebang.
Well, I grew up in Southern Oklahoma. I grew up in a small town. I grew up in a blue collar family. My dad to this day is the hardest worker I know. Growing up, the most successful person that I knew was my uncle. And my uncle was a pharmacist in southwestern Oklahoma. And so he owned several pharmacies. So growing up, I thought, well, if I want to be successful and back then my idea of success was, a nice house and taking my family to Disney World. I thought that, well, if I want to do those things, then I need to be a pharmacist and to own pharmacies as well. So I was probably 13 or 14 years old. I decided that that's what I was going to do and no one was going to stop me. So I went to college. I got into pharmacy school. I graduated there in 2013 and I immediately moved to Texas. And I moved here because there's so many opportunities here. And there's this entrepreneurial spirit here that a lot of places don't have. And it really makes Texas a unique place. So I moved here in 2013. I worked for a chain pharmacy for a few months and then got an opportunity to manage an independently owned compounding pharmacy. So I did that for a year and a half and then had an opportunity to buy my own store. And I purchased my first store, my first pharmacy in 2015. That's where I'm at today in my office. And then a couple years later, got another opportunity to buy an additional store. Had success with that and then was presented with an opportunity to buy a pharmacy in New York, in Manhattan. And so worked through that for about 3 or 4 months, just the same processes that we have here in Texas or the same business model, trying to apply it there. And that was my first time doing business outside of a business friendly state. And you talk about their taxes and their regulations and just how difficult they make it for small businesses. And that's whenever I started thinking a little more politically and wanted to get involved because I wanted to make sure that Texas stayed business friendly. That way, other people either growing up here or moving here with dreams of small business ownership could live that American dream just like I have.
So Republicans are obviously more of the party championing economic freedom and jobs. They're, I think, the top 18 states that are leading economic recovery after the pandemic are all led by Republican legislatures. Texas is included in that top 18, I believe, of the top 20. And so why do you think it's so important for these pro-business, pro-community Republicans to be recruited to run in these down ballot, more local races?
Oh my gosh, Annie, I think it's more important than ever. I talked about that American dream that I wanted to run to fight for, but I think we've all realized in the last year and a half or so just how quickly that American dream can be snatched from you by big government. When you look at the current state of the Democrat Party, just how far to the left that they've gone, they're radical. They've got this radical socialist agenda. They're destroying the economy. They seem primed and ready to lock us down all over again, close our businesses, and to take over our healthcare. And that's, before we even talk about them wanting to redistribute wealth and devaluing work, devaluing the dollar and defunding our police. We have to have strong Republicans up and down the ballot because our country is slipping into the grips of this radical socialist agenda, this radical left-wing ideology, and we have to fight back against it.
Yeah, absolutely. Why do you think that there need to be more people that have a healthcare background that run for office as well?
Well, I think it's important to have people from obviously healthcare, but all different sorts of backgrounds. Whenever I'm talking to voters, standing at their door, I truly understand those issues. I see people that come into the pharmacy that are struggling to pay for their medication. I see people that are having to choose if they're going to get this prescription or that prescription, or if their kids are going to get a prescription. And I think that just a typical politician who's just worked in government all their life, they don't really understand that. They don't know what it's like. So it's issues like that I think it's important to have people with that healthcare background. And me being a pharmacist, specifically working in this sector of healthcare, we need more representation like that in government.
So the kind of people that run for office, I think obviously need to understand their communities and need to represent their communities well, reflect their communities. Why do you think it's important for the Republican Party as a whole to recruit more minorities to run for office?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question. Thomas Sowell, who has been incredibly influential on my life. If you don't know who Thomas Sowell is, I highly recommend that you look him up. But he's got this great quote, and that's that I cannot understand people who say that minorities should be represented everywhere and are upset when there's blacks represented in the conservative movement. And it's really true, and it's something that I've experienced firsthand over the last several years. And when you are a minority candidate or you're a black candidate in the Republican Party, a lot of times you're not just fighting for conservative values. You're also kind of fighting this side battle against the mainstream narrative that, like, if you're not a Democrat, then you ain't black, like President Biden says, or that black people have no diversity of thought. And quite frankly, I'm not sure that there's anything that the left hates more than a black Republican, because we throw a wrench in their entire narrative. I remember back during the primaries last year, I had a Democrat staffer come up to me and say, "Hey, are you Will Douglas?" And I said, "Yes." And they said, "And you're a Republican?" I said, "Yes." And they said, "Oh, well, you're a racist." And in my 32, 33 years of life at that point, not a single person had ever accused me of being a racist. And so that really drove home the point for me that how Democrats, how the left weaponize race. And then again, last year during early voting, I'm talking to some voters, and there's a Democrat staffer not too far away talking to voters also, and she's talking about how the Texas legislature needs to be more diverse. And so naturally, I raise my hand and I say, "Hey, I'm on the ballot over here." And she quips back and says, "Oh, he's a Republican. That doesn't count." So when they talk about diversity, what they really mean is people that think like they do.
And that's no diversity at all.
It's not. And so, it's more important than ever that we have candidates that can fight back against that and can fight back against, this intersectional war machine that the left has built.
So these types of battles that you kind of have to fight on the side as while being like a minority candidate running for office, what kind of advice would you give other candidates like you who are thinking about running or are running and are going to run into these very same struggles?
Well, I think that anyone, regardless of their background, if they're going to get into politics, they have to have pretty thick skin. And so if you're going to be a minority running in the Republican Party, just know that you are going to face a lot of discrimination. You're going to face a lot of slander against you, and it's going to be coming from the left. It's pretty disgusting and vile, some of the things that get hurled around, especially at Black Republicans. All over the country, I think you see that. Some of the things that they say about Senator Tim Scott, some of the things that they say about Congressman Byron Daniels down in Florida, and then just myself, my personal Twitter account. So you have to have thick skin. You've got to be able to ignore that. And at the end of the day, you got to know that you're fighting for something bigger than yourself. And ultimately, you're fighting for what's right.
Yeah, absolutely. What makes you the most optimistic about the Republican Party?
I think that a lot within politics has changed in the last few years, and that seems to be this generational, really dynamic generational shift. And there's a lot of young people that are ready and willing to run for office and to fight for conservative values against the radical left. I'm fortunate enough to be on the board of a great organization, Run Gen Z, and they do an incredible job of empowering and mentoring young people from Generation Z to run for public office. Several months ago, I went out to a Turning Point conference here in Dallas, their Young Women's Leadership Summit, and you have just thousands and thousands of young people who are willing and ready to not just run for office, but to fight these kind of cultural wars. And I think that's good. So when you walk into one of those conferences and you just see, 18 to 35, 40-year-olds ready to go, it's hard not to be optimistic. There's just an energy that's present at these events. And, we are the counterculture now. And so that's a lot of fun. And yeah, it's hard not to be optimistic about the future of the party when you see a lot of young people like that.
People are energized, ready to do big
Absolutely.
things, which
Absolutely.
is awesome. And
they should be.
They say we're the grand old party. One thing that Representative Young Kim says is, I don't really see it as the grand old party. I see it as the grand opportunity party. And I think
I love that.
The more representatives and the more people who view the GOP that way, I think the better it's going to be for our country, for families, for the individual. So really excited to see what you and other like young leaders in our communities are going to do. But shifting the focus a little bit more to Texas, some people are saying that Texas is, becoming a purple state. What you live there. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I honestly, I think that's kind of nonsense. But that doesn't mean that Republicans don't have to work. We're going to have to work hard every single election cycle. In 2020, we held on to the Texas House, and there were tons of predictions, and there were millions and millions of dollars coming into the state from DC and into California in order to flip the House, and Republicans held. And at the same time, we made a lot of strides down on the southern border. And I think that's because Texans, regardless of their skin color, regardless of their creed, they're waking up to the fact that the Republican Party stands up for hard work. It stands up for small businesses, and it stands up for families. And we have a message that resonates with people. And I think it's starting to hit home.
A big part of that message that we've seen over the past year and a half probably has been combating the defund the police movement, and not just the movement as a whole. Like Austin Democrats, for example, literally defunded the police, and now crime is skyrocketing. Right. What can Republicans in the states kind of do to combat the increasingly radical leftist agenda?
Well, and you talked about and made an example out of Austin. And it's obviously it's not just Austin; it's nationwide. It's cities like Baltimore, St. Louis, Minneapolis, Seattle. All these cities under left-wing control, and they've all defunded their police. And these left-wing politicians like to call it reimagining. How reimagining public safety, but really all they've done is create a national nightmare. When I go down to Austin now, it's nothing like what I remember it to be. Then you look at the crime statistics, the murder rates, I believe so far this year have already surpassed what they were all of last year. It's embarrassing. You've got this great city in Texas that's got skyrocketing crime, murders, thefts, and it's directly because of this left-wing agenda to defund police. And make no mistake, we need better trained police officers. We do, and we need more of them. And we need more police in communities that are suffering the most. And the thing is that these politicians that are banging this, defund the police war drum, they don't have to deal with the consequences. They live in nice homes and they have these condos up in the sky. Or, if you're Congresswoman Cori Bush, you have your own personal security detail. But in these communities, it's the people that live there. It's the small businesses that suffer. Unfortunately, here in Texas, we've pushed back on it. Republicans have pushed back on it, and I really just salute the hard work of communities and Republicans in the legislature that are working to overturn these defund efforts.
In addition to, skyrocketing crime, the Democrats are also pushing an increasingly radical tax and spend agenda that has inevitably crippled economic recovery after this pandemic. As a small business owner, how are you being affected by everything from rising inflation to these federal stay-at-home payments?
Right, absolutely. I mean, it touches every aspect of American life. It touches every single aspect of my business. Inflation is certainly rising. You have spending rising faster than I think it ever has in Washington. And I see the consequences of President Biden's approach. Like I talked about earlier, people are increasingly unable to afford their prescriptions. The value of their dollar is going down. Prices are going up. You talk about just here at the pharmacy, we have delivery drivers and gas prices are through the roof. And so then you're having to make a decision. Well, are we going to continue to deliver, folks medication for free whenever we're having to pay these high gas prices? America's at its best when taxes are low and people are at work. Talked about being in Texas and in a state that has rebounded a lot quicker than other states. We continue to fight our way through this entire debacle, but the federal government just seems to want to make things worse. Talked about the stay-at-home payments. That makes it really difficult for small business owners to find employees. I'm fortunate. I have a handful of my employees right on the other side of this wall, working hard and serving our community every day. But not every business is that fortunate, and the government has incentivized people to stay home rather than to go to work. And it's detrimental to obviously to the economy, but I think just the psychological aspect, the damage that has on people when they don't have to get up every day and do something or be responsible for something, it's damaging and it's unfortunate.
Obviously, the federal government is fully controlled by Democrats. What should they be doing instead to kind of help these small businesses get back on their feet?
Well, that's a good question. I think that in short, they need to be pursuing Republican policies. Americans are getting double whammied right now with inflation, and then of course there's going to have to be these inevitable tax hikes just to pay for all the spending. We're trying to grow the economy and help people get back to work is what we need to be doing. But instead, like I said, it feels like we're planning for more lockdowns and even higher spending. There's a reason that Texas has weathered the storm better than most states. We have a balanced budget. And, we're always searching for ways to make it easier to start and grow businesses. Annie, I don't know if you've spent much time in Texas, but people are moving here left and right, not because of our weather. I can promise you that, but it's because of our business climate. We really do make it easy to start a business and to sustain a business.
Another thing that Texas is trying to make it easier to do is vote. So they're trying to make it easier to do, easier to vote, harder to cheat, right? But Texas House Democrats didn't really like that, so they fled the state.
When did this happen? I must have missed that.
I mean, this hasn't been in the national news at all. Like, I've never heard of this. What's going on?
Yeah.
Just the elephant in the room when you're talking about the Texas House. It wasn't just election integrity measures, but other things as well. So, what do you think about them just skipping town, not doing their jobs and still getting paid?
Well, first of all, it's absurd. This was a publicity stunt. They want to claim that it's voter suppression, and that's not the case, and they know it. And them fleeing the state was just a last ditch effort to get attention and to raise money. Period. Unfortunately, they're ignoring their duty to Texans. Listen, regardless of what political ideology people have, these folks were not elected to the Texas House to flee the state on private jets. Texans didn't elect representatives to go hide in Washington, D.C. I mean, if you're trying to get something done, the last place in the world you want to go is to Washington, D.C. It's unfortunate. Texas deserves better leadership, and I think we found out yesterday that a couple of them aren't even in D.C. anymore. They're out of the country. They're on vacation.
Yeah, Portugal, I think, is where a couple
Portugal,
of them
that's right.
So they're just out there having a good time.
Oh, they're having a grand time.
Which is really unfortunate for the Texans that they're supposed to be serving. So,
right. We talked about, all the things that make Texas great. One of the issues that they could have addressed is property taxes. We do have a really good tax climate here in Texas. We don't have an income tax, but one of our dirty little secrets is that we have high property taxes. And that's something that voters year after year want to see addressed. And this special legislative session was supposed to address that, and Republicans are in Austin waiting to make that happen and provide tax relief for Texans, and Democrats are in DC on a fundraising field trip.
What are some of the other bills that were being proposed and were supposed to be voted on that didn't get passed or didn't even get addressed because these Democrats just skipped town?
Yeah, there's a lot. Again, this was a special session. It was a unique session because of COVID. The legislature got started late, so to give more time, Governor Abbott called for a special session to get a lot of these items solved for Texans. Just to name a few, there's bail reform, which would keep our streets safer. You talk about border security, which under the Biden administration has been a complete and total disaster. You have thousands of people lined up on our southern border, a lot of them carrying COVID, just pouring in on a daily basis. There were domestic violence prevention measures. There was a Texas retirement or Texas retired teachers funding. Retired teachers were expecting to get a little additional income, and teachers are supposed to be one of Democrats' strongest voting blocks, and they turned their back on them. We've already talked about the property tax relief, and as well as fixing our foster care system. The list goes on and on. There were a lot of priorities, a lot of bills that would help Texans, and Democrats turned their backs on it. It's incredibly disappointing. And in fact, just before I joined you on this podcast, Governor Abbott has called a second special session. So it's going to be interesting to see whether or not Democrats make it back to Texas for that, so they can serve the people that they were elected by.
One of the left's main arguments against some of these voter integrity measures is that requiring voter ID is racist. As a Black man, what's your response to that argument?
Well, it's insulting. The suggestion that because of someone's race, they're unable to acquire an ID. It's absurd. And if there are, people running around the state without an ID, then that's the problem we need to address and figure out why these people don't have access to IDs, and figure out how to get them, provide them with an identification. Listen, 80 some odd % of Americans support voter ID laws. This isn't to suppress the minority vote. This is to ensure secure elections. Listen, I work here in a pharmacy. You cannot pick up a controlled medication in the state of Texas without an ID. I have never once in my 8 years of working in a pharmacy seen anyone say that they cannot, get their medication because they don't have ID. And we, serve people from all socioeconomic backgrounds. You can't hop on a plane without ID. You can't buy a case of Miller Lite without ID, and you can't check into a swanky DC hotel without ID either. So it's really just hypocrisy from the Democrats. They know they're on the wrong side of this issue, and right now they're in DC throwing a temper tantrum because of it.
A lot of Democrat states, including Joe Biden's home state of Delaware, have less access to voting than Texas does. What do you think of their hypocrisy generally on this election integrity issue? They're grandstanding.
Yeah. Absolutely. They absolutely are. And what's lost in all of this is that this bill expands early voting. You talked about Joe Biden's home state of Delaware doesn't have early voting. Texas has nearly 2 weeks of it. This bill expands voting hours from 8 hours to 9 hours, and it ensures that if you're in line to vote, you are able to cast your vote even if the polls have closed. Listen, this ensures the integrity of people's vote. It bans ballot harvesting, where literally paid operatives will go prey on unsuspecting voters, usually senior citizens, and cast their ballots for them. So if you're a paid operative by a specific party, which box do you think that you're going to be checking on that? This is something that Americans want. It's something that Americans need. And Texas Republicans are leading the charge on this.
Yeah, absolutely. And we love to see it. Okay, well, that was my last question for today. So do you have any final thoughts for our listeners?
No, Annie, I do appreciate it. I appreciate you having me on. I talk about it all the time. The Texas House is really important. Texas is a big state, and that saying, "So goes Texas, so goes the nation." So hopefully people keep their eye on the Texas House and the things that we're able to get accomplished, not just for Texans, but for the rest of the country as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Will, thanks so much for joining us. Loved having you and being able to kind of pick your brain on some of this stuff. And everyone, thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're listening to. If you're on YouTube, subscribe. And always remember, state politics have implications that are bigger than you think.